I just wanted to say thank you to Sean. That was such an inspiring story, and it sounds like you're doing great stuff there. And also a comment I wanted to make that Tony might be interested in. So like Sean, you know, I had a problem. I'm 6 years. Okay, I was muted. Did you hear any of that?
Only for a second. I do apologise. I think that was a technical hitch. No, sorry.
Shall I start again?
No, don't start again. You're muted for about a second.
Okay. So yeah, well done, Sean. Like you, I had an issue. I stopped drinking 6 years ago, and since then I've been helping other people. And I tend to work with, as Tony would call them, the baby boomers. And I just wanted to comment on the kind of pattern that I've noticed after working with hundreds of people. I mean, women predominantly. And their pattern is similar to my pattern. And what happens is that in their 20s and 30s, they're social drinkers. You know, they've got a good social life, they're building their families, their careers, etc. So they get into just the habits of drinking. But by their 40s and 50s, it's more switching to self-medication and using alcohol to manage stress, to manage depression, to manage anxiety, and often drinking alone. And the average that the people that I work with are drinking is a bottle of wine every evening. And that's been totally normalized, I think, in England and certainly here in South Africa. It's not seen as problematic drinking at all. But in fact, of course, that's 7 bottles of wine a week, probably a bit more at the weekend. And that's very, very much higher than the low risk guidelines. So, and obviously, as we all know, alcohol makes anxiety and depression much worse. And many of the people that I work with, they're already on meds for anxiety and depression. So the alcohol's, you know, counteracting the meds. And I've just seen again and again when people manage to quit, their anxiety lifts, they can come off their meds. You know, I've seen some beautiful stories. So I just wanted to make that comment about the pattern, particularly with us ladies as we get older. So many of us, and you know, as you can hear, I'm British, and now I know so many South African women that have gone through the same.
That's one. It's a very a fundamental point, I think, is about the obviously connection between alcohol and anxiety and depression. It's a drum I bang on a regular basis, and I know that Tony does also. So if I may just spotlight him for a second, perhaps he can come in, and if you could unmute yourself, Tony, that would be great. If you've just got any thoughts on this you know thing we've obviously heard from regularly about anxiety and depression and drinking.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's really interesting point. This because there are 2 observations from this point of view. One is that a lot of the work on women's drinking and the difference between men and women has come out from Scandinavia, and that's been going on for about sort of 10-20 years. So what we know is that the gap between men and women, between women and men in drinking and drinking harmfully has changed over the last 20 years. So whereas it might have been like 4-to-1 or 3-to-1, it's about 2-to-1 now. And I think that reflects both in the sort of statistics and also people accessing services. So that's the important thing to bear in mind. Obviously the role, and so with the sort of baby boomer population of women, if you remember that I'm 55 now, but if you remember sort of in the 80s, there was that sort of ladette culture, wasn't there? And whether it's here, whether it's Australia, whether it's South Africa, those ladettes have grown older, plus the fact that women have got more disposable income and a different kind of role with drinking, and perhaps seeing women seeing themselves as why can't they be like men in how much they drink. The other interesting thing is about the way that women react to stress, and this has been the subject of a lot of research. Women tend to drink more, as you said, Jana, in response to emotional events, and so the research has shown that women drink in response to what's called affective reactivity. So in response to sort of traumatic events that affect their emotions, rather than men don't tend to do that sort of thing, not to the same degree. So I hope that offers an important insight into the observations that you've just mentioned.
Yeah, and yeah, and I've noticed that we drink, the women drink to numb our emotions because sometimes they're just too uncomfortable. And the people that I work with, as they stop drinking, they often contact me and they say, "Oh, I feel so emotional. I can't stop crying and thinking about this and that." And I just tell them, it's part of it, and we have to learn how to deal with our emotions, and that they're not bad. Even if you feel sad, it's important to experience that, I think. So yeah, and other points, about the Ladettes, I remember them well. I think that these days, even more than in the 80s, the media are targeting women ruthlessly, especially the wine industry. I mean, here in South Africa, I'm in the wine region, and they just, the glamorization of wine, and women are led to believe that we can't possibly have a full and happy life unless we've got a glass of wine beside us, and it's just been so normalized. It's because I don't drink and the people that I work with are gradually stopping. We are seen as very odd people because we don't drink.
And the other thing, Janet, to mention is that I recently did a similar webinar with Royal College of Psychiatrists, and the thing that the sort of women, the older women, not the older women, but the older women, people of my age and perhaps younger, talk about is the fact that drink refusal skills are quite difficult. So because of the baby boomer, the kind of environment in which we were brought up was that you were a social outcast if you didn't drink. Yeah, and I think that's the problem that's perpetuated and maintained itself now with older women having difficulty with drink refusal skills.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very key point. We've obviously gender is a very key issue, and I think actually it's come up very recently about how women are being sort of targeted specifically as a drinking population. And I mean, the point I've made about this before is that men have been targeted in this way and using their gender as a sort of hook for their drinking over decades and decades. So it's very interesting to see how this is developing. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. It's a bit old-fashioned way to do it, but that's about the best I can. I can see there's somebody from Drinkwise Age Well there with the glasses on, so be prepared to be spotlighted.
Hi,
introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm John Nelson. I work at Drinkwise Age Well, and mine's an observation which I don't know if some of the speakers who want to comment on about baby boomers and older drinkers, and it's the language that people use, older people, about alcohol, which is, in my experience, very different from the way younger people talk about alcohol. And particularly, there's a language that surrounds things about alcohol being naughty but nice. So you'll get people say they're going out for a cheeky beer. There's the old, as I think Janet in South Africa alluded to, the wine o'clock culture, which has crept in as well. And that alcohol is can be naughty, but it's fun as well. It's almost like a permissive permissive culture around alcohol, in which as is also mentioned just now, you're seen to be not quite this, you're outside of the social groupings often if you don't indulge in that permissive, naughty kind of nice behaviour. And it's a mindset, basically, that when you're dealing with older people and alcohol problems, you've got to get around that kind of mindset, and then it can be an obstacle for talking to helping people when they've got these kinds of mindsets around their drinking and what drinking and the cultural significance of drinking plays in older people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you have a question maybe for one of the panelists? Is something that was raised in the?
I'd like to ask well, perhaps for Tony, and does his research and experience bear this out? And if we have an issue with a particular cultural attachment to drinking. If drinking is seen as central to the way people behave within an older generation, how do you break that down? How do you say alcohol is the nice way of talking about alcohol, the fun way? How do you get across the dangerous and damaging ways that alcohol can have on people's lives as well? And basically around the use of language to describe these things.
I don't. If you talk, so I'm not an addiction psychiatrist, but if you talk to addiction psychiatrists, they'll tell you, and I've learned a lot from them, that over the last over the centuries, we've had wet periods and dry periods, and we've had prohibition, and then we've had gin lane. And I think that the thing that we're going to have to accept is that alcohol is going to be with us for centuries. But maybe there's something, maybe Melissa hasn't answered it, apart from the fact that young people can't afford to drink, or they're more thrifty with their money, and obviously alcohol isn't seen as a quality kind of landmark preference. Is there anything that older people can learn from younger people in terms of improving their health through not drinking as much? Because as I've always said in the media, that the problem with my generation is that we were brought up in an era where advertising was rife and it was really cool to drink, and we're not really bothered about the health risks, and we've grown up with that, and it's something that's still with us.
So over to you, Melissa. You've been put on the spot, but
sorry, there's building work here, so it might be horribly loud. There was just a couple of things that I wanted to say on this. So I think the one thing that you say is, particularly amongst kind of older generations, this focus on alcohol and alcohol being involved in all these different kinds of events and occasions, and almost being the focus of those occasions sometimes, is so normalized. And I think most people who in those older age groups drink, the majority do. So it's kind of breaking that perception that this level of heavy drinking is normal. And actually, I think Adrian Childs, the TV presenter, he kind of did a documentary and he's done a few articles about kind of that realization. So he's somebody who has drank every day of his life. And then he kind of got to a point where he realized what he was doing and how harmful that was, and kind of got into the habit of breaking. And I think actually having people who've got that lived experience talking about it is really important to highlight that it's not normal. And I think that does kind of the contrast with the younger age groups as well is really important. So amongst younger people now, particularly kind of teenagers aged, most people don't drink, or most people drink very lightly. So it's kind of the norm is almost not to drink. So I think it's kind of understanding alcohol's place for different people in their lives. And like you said before, it's about trying to break that. And I do think particularly for older age groups, part of that is not going to be people like me telling them it's dangerous. It's going to be people who've got that experience, who've been through it, kind of putting that message out there instead, perhaps.
I think that is a cue for me to switch to ask Sean if he may give us a little bit of experience that he's had for either working with people with these direct experiences.
Like I say, like the people I work with, like they can be quite varied, and like I say, is like because we're only allowed to work with people from 18, but the oldest person we've had is 88. And the guy, we had to help him up the stairs, to be fair, but he went to that meeting. But his drinking was at such a level, it was controlled, but I mean, it was a minimum of 12 pints per day. Now, drinking 12 pints per day at 88, I mean, roughly, depending on what kind of alcohol it was, I mean, you're talking roughly between 2.3, 2.7 units. So, times that by 12, like, I mean, he's above the 3-4 unit NHS recommended values. And then if I do the flip side and I look at the younger people, like, I mean, they would think twice about down on a bottle of vodka within 2 hours, which is 36 units. So although he was drinking chaotically, it was controlled because he was using it as a social aspect, and he wouldn't go out the door till 12, but he would drink those 12 pints before he went home. And it's almost like there's a kind of routine in with the older people, and they're a bit more set, right, I won't drink till that time. And sometimes we'll have what's called a hairy of the dog in the morning to get them going if they're kind of that suffering. So the alcohol is... The actual behaviour it's the same but different, if you know what I mean. I say the same as like both of them are doing harmful, so that's the correlation. but I mean, it's different because the older people slow it down. And then the younger people, well, they might take cocaine, or they might mix up with Valiant or come down, and they'll just be a little faster, harder. And I think the best way to describe it, like the most deaths I've seen is younger people. The recent one, she was only 27, and she was drinking twice as hard as that older guy, and that guy's been doing that for years. So it just goes to show you, like, you know, the difference. And it is honestly, when you look at the liver trust and that as well, it's a lottery as well. It also depends how your liver performs and breaking down alcohol. I mean that's a big key factor. So hopefully that kind of answers like some of the trends I've spotted, like by using real case examples.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. I think one little anecdote. I think the only time I've got in a car with somebody who was hopelessly drunk, and the person driving the car was well into his 70s. So it shows that you don't necessarily, behaviours don't always fall into some sort of stereotype. So if you could just raise your hand, then I can just sort of scroll through, and if you want to ask a question, and is that Julie Breslin, I believe, is raising her hand. So if I can hit the button there.
Hi there, and first of all, thanks to Tony, Sean and Melissa for great presentation. So I'm Julie Breslin, and I'm with Drinkwise Age Well too, and I noticed a question from Victoria about what it is. Drinkwise Age Well is a UK-wide programme that's run for 5 years that helps to supports older adults to make healthier choices about their alcohol as they age. We do that through delivering prevention and awareness campaigns, because very often alcohol campaigns don't target older adults, and interventions and home visits and outreach support to people, as well as kind of building people's resilience. And we're just currently going through our end of programme data after running for 5 years. So just a couple of things just to point out, back to the isolation thing. Of the people that we've supported in Drinkwise Age Well, nearly 80% drink at home alone. And I just think that's a really important factor to consider in terms of how we reach people, but also in the context of COVID, is the people that we've supported may not necessarily be affected by not being able to go out anymore, but does their alcohol use change within the home? So it's just looking at how that affects them. Just a question for Tony. I suppose we're at the end of the programme and we still quite can't figure out, is there a need to have specialist services for older adults in substance use, or do we need to make sure that generic substance use services are more age inclusive?
Thanks, Julie.
Sorry, Tony.
That's all right. I mean, this is something I've been talking about for years, and in fact, the very reason that I started taking an interest in this area, and I think Julie knows this, was that I got exasperated by seeing that umpteenth older, was an older Irish sort of a drinker who worked on the roads all his life, socially isolated and coming in with dementia. And I realized that there wasn't a service for him. And I can honestly say with my hand on my heart, 15 years later, that's still the case. That I don't want to be rude, but I wouldn't put my trust in general addiction services being able to provide a service for our older drinkers. And I think the problem with, say, the Royal College of Psychiatrists is that both the addictions faculty and the old age faculty are very separate, and they're not prepared to endorse each other's skills for having a specialist service. So whether it's an old age psychiatrist like me trying to improve the detection of addiction problems within mental health, or the opposite, I think we need to do something. I don't think we're ever going to win. I hope the legacy from Drinkwise Age Well is that there's a recommendation, there is a specialist older person's addiction service or services around the country.
You mentioned that sort of gone out of focus. In reality, not metaphorically. Can I just ask you another quick question about the institutional aspects of this? The intersection between alcohol problems and mental health problems. Could you maybe I've heard in other conversations I've had that people have had difficulty. Which route do you take? Do you go through a mental health route, or do you go through an addiction route? And I just wondered whether you might be able to shed a bit of light onto that, Tony, as somebody who's obviously out there in the field.
Yeah, so I feel like what I can tell you is that it's not to do with need; it's to do with money, unfortunately, these days. And we all know that there was there are various tweets going around about, we know that the public health budget has been cut by something like 100 million, and so drug and alcohol services aren't what they used to be, and it's been made worse, I think, with sort of lack of addiction services within the NHS. So there is no simple answer to this. Certainly what I found is that when people want to access help for their drug and alcohol problems, they will come to addiction services. And if they're an older person, the addiction services will say to them, well, they very often say to them, we can't deal with your mental health problem, addiction problem, until your mental health problem is sorted out. And then they come to mental health. So that's what happened. That's the reason why I did my MSc and took an interest in this area, because people were being battered between services. And so it's all potluck as to which service they approach first. But very often what happens is that mental health services are, in inverted commas, lumbered with the problem. And what I've always said is that I'm not an addiction psychiatrist, but if we can, within mental health services, improve the quality and workforce development to improve the assessment and the brief intervention and the referral to addiction services, and I think we're doing something good. But the answer is that there is no simple answer. Yeah.
Can I ask Forrest, if I were to have a combination of alcohol problems and mental health problems, which is the best route to go down? Do I go and see a mental health person, or do I go and see an addiction person?
Well, I'm a bit biased here, because I would say that within our trust, our addictions knowledge, so our knowledge about how to provide support for alcohol problems, is probably more than the awareness of addiction services in dealing with mental health problems, particularly in older people. But one of the interesting things, I don't want to go on about this, but one of the interesting things was I went to see an addiction service. I went to see a sort of in Greenwich. It was I think it's lost its tender now to the voluntary sector. And one of the things I was really aware of is that how much addiction services are trauma-based services. Whereas with older people, there is an increased recognition now that trauma is very important as a cause, and Julia knows this, as a cause of the development of mental health problems and addiction in later life, so alcohol problems. But one of the things that addiction services are not that good at managing is things like sort of bog standard depression, or the treatment of depression, or health problems in later life, or dementia and things like that, which is why I think we need a separate service for, say for older people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Tony. I realise I batted two questions to you there in one go. But if anybody has a question or an observation to make, please raise your hand, and I shall scroll through and pick you out. I think Jean Dean. Sorry, I can't see the end of your name. Here we are. You're on. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. In fact, I do cause confusion with my name. British, French name, Mauritian.
Jean, excuse me.
So it's Jean. Congratulations to all the three speakers, which I really sort of soaked in the angle of approach in terms of alcoholism and mental health. I want to ask you first, in terms of distinguishing between binge drinking and chronic drinking. To Tony, is there still a denial among people he sees, or people who may be seen in primary care? And are we just at the tip of the iceberg with alcohol problems?
Okay, thanks, John. As I say, I think perhaps Julie, because Julie's had experience in the alcohol field with younger age group as well, and Melissa can answer this question. But one of the things I've realised in older people, and I think this applies to the across the board, is our lack of awareness about the scale of binge drinking. So I can tell you this in my older population. I can tell you this for definite, that when I see people and I look at their audit score, I look at how much they've been drinking over the year, and they've been drinking quite a lot, and then they say they haven't drunk in the last week, and then you look at their blood tests and it shows that their liver function's all over the place, or it isn't, if you see what I mean, if they have been drinking. But I think binge drinking is probably, so just for people who don't know, and I'm sure you all know this, binge drinking is very much a product of what we call the Scandinavian pattern of drinking. So something we inherited from the Anglo-Saxon and Viking invasions of sort of 12th and 13th century. And that is particular to the Scandinavian countries. So you don't see binge drinking as much, say, in South America or in India or say in America, well, maybe America. So I only want to say from a binge drinking point of view that I think we need to do more to detect binge drinking. And perhaps Melissa and Sean might want to comment on that.
Yeah, raise your hand, Melissa or Sean, if you want to comment on binge drinking, or do you have a point to make on either of those, Melissa or? Yeah.
I kind of.
Yeah, let me. You're in. Yeah, you're on. Sorry, I'm a bit amateurish.
That's fine. Yeah, so I think one thing in terms of kind of the detecting binge drinking, one of the kind of key things at the moment is the brief interventions in kind of primary care, where they give the audit and then people are given advice around binge drinking and they're drinking more widely. But I do think that is, although it's good for some groups, it's not kind of administered very consistently. So in some ways it's quite good, because I think it is generally people who are of lower socioeconomic position who are more likely to get administered it, and they're actually more at risk of harms. So in terms of, I mean, if there's going to be kind of inconsistency in the way it's applied, it's at least in the right direction at the moment. But I do think the question about, are we at the tip of the iceberg, is really interesting, because although we are seeing declines in young people, which you would expect over time to kind of hopefully be maintained and to kind of lead to less problems overall, as I was saying before, there is kind of this very new and at the moment small body of work which seems to be suggesting that although they're drinking less overall, binge drinking is actually increasing. And I think that is really problematic, because there is, you know, that is the most harmful kind of drinking, and that is where most of the harms lie. So I think looking at overall trends is not enough. You need to consider what's happening within it, what's happening within drinking occasions as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that's obviously specific to, as Tony said, the sort of Northern European countries. This it's really getting you money's worth out of a small amount of alcohol. If you want to get the biggest bang for the buck, then you drink it all in one go. And it's unfortunately, from a sort of mental health and brain function point of view, is probably the worst thing you can do. But I see Jean has got his hand up there. Let me just sort that out. Yeah.
Yes. Well, no, thank you very much for that. Those responses, Tony. I totally agree. You made my day by mentioning liver function tests, which is used in laboratory testing. And the reason why I ask those questions is because it fascinates me. Every type of alcohol topic or lecture I attend, the one aspect which seems to be left out is, what do we do about laboratory diagnostic testing for alcohol consumption? And in the UK, you will find people will say, well, you must just see what your liver is doing. It only affects the liver, and you'll get the enzymes or the proteins in the liver which are affected. But in fact, as you're all aware, alcoholism affects the mental state, the reproductive state, and all sorts of physiological changes. The reason I ask this, because if I say the word CDT, it's possible some of you may have heard of it, or some of you may not have, but this is a simple laboratory test for blood, whereby you can distinguish whether somebody is a chronic abuser. And it's been on the market for since 2008. In fact, it goes back to the 70s, but many people didn't know about it. And currently, this sort of test is used in what they call forensic testing. For example, the DVLA uses this test, the aviation industry. But I live in East London, in Hackney, and my wife is actually a GP. And the reason I asked the previous questions was, of the 80% of patients she actually sees for the 10-minute slots they have, that was pre-COVID, most of them said would come in with depression, feeling isolated, and not knowing what the real cause was, whether thyroid problems or some other issue. And because we had the CDT testing available locally in East London, so we had coached the GPs to ask their patient, like doing HIV testing, whether they would consent to doing this test. And would you believe it? Most of these people, in fact, were found to be chronic abusers. What is quite curious is this CDT testing, the CDT is called carbohydrate deficient transferrin. It's elevated specifically in chronic abuse. So anyone at risk of chronic abuse will have a positive test for this marker. But it only takes, as Janet said she drank a bottle of wine. Half a bottle of wine a day, 2 pints of beer, or 125 ml of spirits for 7 to 10 days will cause this marker to be elevated. And not only that, some people, for example, the police will stop somebody at the road and measure alcohol in their blood. That's a direct on-the-spot marker. This marker actually has a half-life of 2 weeks. So it actually takes 2 weeks for it to disappear from the blood system. So therefore you can, if you ask somebody how much they've been drinking in terms of filling questionnaires, which is what frustrates my wife, is they will always tell you they're drinking half the amount they're supposed to. And I think Tony will agree with that. So it's always double it up. And therefore, this has been very useful in assessing such cases. And as Sean has said, this type of marker is extremely relevant in veterans returning from wars and whatever they've been in, because they would tend to turn to alcohol. But I think there's very much, if you like, a distinction between the psychology, if you like, the non-laboratory testing of conditions. And of course, here we have a test which has been in existence for quite a number of years, available, but in fact, it hasn't been, if you like, gelled together. The women who are pregnant, you've heard about fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. Women who should be tested for this test. You know, we've spent less than a year generating COVID testing, and yet we haven't really, all of us, pointed out on a marker for alcohol test. And I'm telling you, there's one available now. The reason I say this is, I'm sorry, I'll leave the floor to you, is I'm promoting the test equally for people in this field, because I'm the chair of the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry for CDT Testing Working Group. So we are heavily trying to make people aware, particularly psychiatrists, that this test is available, and I think should probably work hand in hand with the work that you're doing. So therefore, with people, we've noticed, if you have a result in black and white, a number, and we're not telling people they must stop drinking, but it's a way for them to, if you like, to do an MOT of their drinking lifestyle. And this is how actually the test became very successful in East London, not accusing people saying you've got a drink problem, but it's really, why don't you assess your drinking lifestyle? And this have a wide spectrum. Primary care is the first instance, emergency departments, the armed forces, the transport industry, needless to say, but you can guess for yourself, there's a massive plethora of testing that's available, but this is in fact the up-to-date and most specific marker for testing chronic alcohol consumption.
Can I just quickly ask you a question? It sounds to me like obviously somebody who's written about this and sort of tried to make sense of these statistics. I mean, it sounds like the perfect tool for a journalist, let alone a doctor. So could you tell me why is this not being used?
The reason being, there were the manufacturers who manufactured the test, the CDT test in the 80s, each had their own ways to manufacture the marker, so how you would measure it in the laboratory, let's say, and each of them had a different cutoff for the CDT. So in a court of law, if you had manufacturer A with its cutoff, and then you had yours assessed by manufacturer B, the judge could not decide whether this person needed to have their license suspended, revoked, or re-granted. So within the International Federation, I'll go IFCC for short, you can check it on the internet or through my LinkedIn page. It is that what we've done as a group of scientists, and I thank you, Phil, for saying in terms of publication, I've published nothing. I'm a laboratory scientist by profession. We've devised a way, and the International Federation, every blood test you have has to go through this body, to standardize the test for all the manufacturers. So in 2017, the test is now known as CDT IFCC. So anywhere you go in the world and you have this test done, it varies from 15, 20 pounds to some crooks who will charge you up to 100 pounds for those. But it does vary in price, but it has one cutoff. 1.8%, the CDT value, will show that you are clinically at risk, and a value of 2% confirms forensically that you are at risk of alcohol consumption. It doesn't relate to the amount of alcohol that is drunk, but it actually gives you a black and white picture that this person is at risk and has to be helped further.
Okay, well, many thanks for that. It sounds like one to dig into, because it's not possibly going to be able to go into the complexity of that in the next 10 minutes, but certainly a more clearer sort of black and white, as you say, picture of what people's drinking status is would clearly help everybody across this throughout this group. I think Janet has got her hand raised. If anybody else has got a hand raised, prepare after Janet has spoken. We're nearing the end. I shall do one or two more rounds, and then we're probably finished.
Hi, Jean. I just wanted to say that was really interesting because so many people say to me, oh, I'm drinking a bottle of wine a week, a night. I have been doing for years. I'm absolutely fine. I have regular liver tests at the doctor, and my blood tests are absolutely fine for the liver. And I say to them, because I know that there must be some reaction to this, so I recommend that they rather have a liver stiffness test. I think that might be slightly more helpful. But this CDT test sounds so interesting. I'm going to see if I imagine they do it in the laboratories here in South Africa.
Oh, yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I'll switch you in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, so in fact, it's done in very few places in the world, but I was trying to promote it in South Africa earlier this year before COVID, and particularly with the airline industry. It's mainly done in Europe at the moment, and very little is done in the rest of the world, so which is most unfortunate. But as you say, anyone who tells you that they are going to have liver function tests in relation to alcohol, I must tell you now, it is a load of rubbish. They are non-specific, particularly the markers. They are not sensitive, but CDT is the way to go forward. I'm not promoting it because I'm doing it, but I tell you, it is the most logical way to go forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll find out more. Thanks.
That's absolutely fascinating. It definitely would help, as I say, would help a lot of us, I think, to know, clearly what the case is, rather than relying on people's testimony. So one more round of maybe another question, and maybe if we go back to the panel, they can pick up on what Jean has said. Anybody wants to pose a question or make a point, then please raise your hand, or virtually or non-virtually. Or maybe you can just so Vince says, excuse me, bear with me a second, Vince. Let me find the little doodle. There we go. Vince, you're on.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for the CDT report. It's something to look at in future meetings, probably.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to the health problems. I know for the rest of Drinkwise Age Well areas, we did a little thing for calling time for change, and we did a co-production advocacy group, and some of the points that were brought up in that have been covered by the panel so far, but obviously the coordination between alcohol and mental services to respond to co-occurring conditions and awareness in the increased risks of dual diagnosis in older adults. We feel that collaboration between mental health and service providers, drug addiction services, is very important. Some of our people have experienced these problems. Also down to the funding. Again, Tony mentioned about it always comes down to funding. Do the panel feel that the introduction of minimum pricing, unit pricing in Scotland and Wales was a missed opportunity to create a levy, so to speak, for the alcohol producers and sellers to actually put that extra money that was made into a pot that can be used for services?
Yeah, I think on a sort of technical level, I'm not an expert in this, and I think Melissa probably certainly is, having worked with the group that was involved in devising it. But yeah, I don't think it actually raises more money. It's just it's a minimum price, and there's no sort of, it's not a taxation levy. But yeah, I'll just bring Melissa in because she can answer that more fully than me. But yeah, we can certainly let's go into that. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So just starting off by saying I'm not a modeller and by no means an expert in MUP, but I have worked very closely with the group who are, so I do know a little bit about it. And I agree. So although it's not a levy, there is money that comes out of it and that's made. I think that's generally given to the producers, but it's very strange the way that they can work it basically with it across different products that they order from different places. But the short answer to your question is yes. So I think it's a bit short-sighted to kind of take all those drinks that we know are the really harmful drinks, like the very strong ciders, the very cheap spirits, and to implement a policy where they're going to become unaffordable for a lot of people without an increase and an investment in services to go alongside it. And I think it's so difficult because does that mean you shouldn't do the policy in the first place because those services aren't there? But I know that some of the kind of the earlier evaluations of the policy, that's kind of the messages that are coming out of it, is that that investment needs to be there. So as someone who's, again, not an expert in it, yes, I do agree with you. I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity really in terms of getting revenue for those services and for them to kind of have that boost in funding. But yeah.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Sorry to put you on the spot slightly there, and maybe slightly mistaking your involvement in that. But it's not a tax raising measure. It's a sort of minimum price, and there are arguments, as far as I understand it, that the producers will make an extra profit as a result of this, and they're still being evaluated. But as you say, it would be interesting to see what might happen. I'm going to ask Sean, if I may, who lives in Scotland, as to whether or not this has had any particular impact on the way, people he knows who are drinkers and the drinking habits they've had to have MUP, and people maybe who are involved in the groups you run. If you could just unmute yourself and maybe give us some thoughts on that.
Well, as a kind of charity member, paid employee in Scotland, I get a bit frustrated about, obviously, because I know where the money should be going. The money should be going into services and preventive, go right back to school. It's a whole big, huge subject. But the initial impact we've seen from the minimum alcohol was basically, we've seen less street drinkers, believe it or not, because obviously, you could be able to buy a 3 litre bottle of White Lightning, which is 15 units, and you could buy that for £3 or £2.99 if it was really cheap. Now that would cost you in excess of £11 or £12. So what I did kind of notice in my local area, because I always pay attention to my local area, I think when you want to see an impact, you just look at your surroundings really. It's probably the best correlation you can make. On the buses, I've seen some of the local dependent drinkers, they were drinking, instead of carrying about big large bottles, they just went to small quarter bottles of alcohol, because it's alcohol they need. It wouldn't matter what price they were going to pay for it, they just swap products. So we're not really tackling the problem by raising the price, because we're not really tackling the reason why they were drinking. And also, Drinkaware, they'll send almost no Drinkaware, sorry, some of the big whiskey companies recently in Edinburgh, they offered up to £10,000, but Smart Recovery weren't eligible because we were already a registered charity. But we were we could use that to develop more meetings and maybe put some money into research, because we've got our CEO who's got a PhD and she's involved with NHS research, and we can actually see how Smart works and if we can do stuff better, to be honest. Because I think we should always be improving. I don't believe Smart's got all the answers, but we should definitely be looking at improvements constantly, how we can provide a better service. But hopefully that answers your question, Phil.
It does indeed. There is some people have raised objections to MUP in that it might encourage, by increasing the price of alcohol, it might, you mentioned, I think, in the comments somewhere about people who use other substances as well. Have you noticed people switching to different, favouring one substance as opposed to alcohol as it gets more expensive?
Yeah. Well, basically, the biggest impact I've seen, the Scotland's, and I don't know if you looked at the kind of drug deaths as well. I know it's slightly off topic from alcohol, but 67% of the drug deaths in 2018, I know they didn't do it 2019 because of COVID. We're right, we're probably the highest in the world now. But a lot of that's to do with kind of street Valium. Now it's not even Valium, it's like Tizolam, Flazepam, and lots of different names and stuff like that. But I can buy that in the dark web and get it delivered to my house for peanuts. And now, guess what Valium does is it kicks almost the same receptors as alcohol. So I mean, once the people like who have alcohol and can't afford it, and they can get it for that, we sometimes see that jump. But that's not on everyone. I couldn't generalise that to everyone, but I have seen people go straight from alcohol addiction into a Valium addiction, or use both, which is even more scarier. And hence, they become then a drug deficit statistic instead of an alcohol statistic. The whole system, in my personal opinion, now, I wouldn't like to speak for all the UK, I think the whole system's broken. They're too busy fighting each other rather than just like all working together. That's just an observation. But obviously that doesn't happen everywhere. I'd love to see us all kind of network and tackle, you know, what is it, why in the UK do we binge drink so much? I mean, why are we behaving like so dramatically, and why are we not behaving like, say, like we do in Portugal? It's quite interesting.
Excellent point. Yeah, hopefully this is one step on that road. And we're going to ask Tony to pick up maybe on what John said about the test, and maybe also about this MUP, and maybe some thoughts that he's had over, you know, the span of the comments that have come up there. And then we're coming up towards 3 o'clock in the UK, and we can sort of wrap up. But yeah, I'll just switch over to Tony and maybe check in on his thoughts, and then yeah.
Okay.
You're on, Tony. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. As far as CDT goes, I don't want to eat too much, as I said in the chat. I don't want to eat too much into the conversation here, but it's interesting that I first came across CDT when I was a houseman in Charing Cross in 1990, Jean. So interesting, because I worked for a hepatologist who was there. So I mean, CDT is expensive, but it certainly is a lot more, it tells you a lot more about the alcohol-related damage. So it's a lot more sensitive and specific compared with standard tests such as what's called MCV, so big blood cells, and also gamma GT, which is an enzyme in the liver. I don't really have much of a comment about minimum unit pricing, other than to kind of support the organization in which I'm a member, and that's the Alcohol Health Alliance, in saying that there's just such good evidence that although reasonable drinkers, people not drinking heavily, will be paying a slightly more of an amount per week for their alcohol, in the end it's for the public good, and it will reduce the burden of alcohol-related harm in this country, well, for England, because it's not being considered at the moment, in spite of the fact the coalition government promised it in 2012. And I have to say that I do think it will reap rewards in reducing alcohol-related harm.